Instead, I'm going to be joined by two guests. One's with me now. I'm just waiting for one further one. And we were hearing before the break about, the sort of crises that seem to be besetting the world. And I think there's maybe an assumption that once we get out of the COVID one, then we're in the clear. But actually, there's a bigger one either around the corner or, I think, as we're about to hear, currently on our doorstep. So I'm delighted that I'm currently joined by Joanne Lee, a former GB hockey player and now working on the sustainability aspects of the Commonwealth Games. That's right, Joey?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And we will at some point be joined by Toby Robbins from the British Association for Sustainable Sport. I think he's just coming through. So maybe while we do that, Joy, do you want to just give us a sort of quick rundown of yourself and how you came to be involved in this field?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Craig. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, Joey Lee. As Craig said, I'm a former sort of hockey player for England and Great Britain. So I guess that was my first career, sort of alongside university and then post-university. But I've always had this interest in sustainability. So I studied geography at university and always kept this sort of eye post-sport that this was a field I wanted to go into. So when I sort of stepped back from international hockey in, I think it was 2018 now, it was something I looked at more seriously and started to get into that profession. And as you can imagine, with my sporting background, that sustainability and sport element is something I've also been equally passionate about. So to now be in a role with Birmingham 2022, so Commonwealth Games happening next year, is super exciting to sort of bring those two passions together. And yeah, it's like anything in this field, it's such a fast evolving field and everyone's learning together. And yeah, I'm learning as well. So it's great to kind of be part of these discussions and see this agenda point kind of becoming higher up the agenda as people sort of really look to think how they can bring it into the conversations that they're having.
Yeah, I think when we spoke recently, I sort of admitted to maybe getting it slightly wrong. I mean, there's nothing unusual about me being wrong about something. That's quite a mundane event. But I thought that given the year that everybody's had, that maybe organizations be forgiven for maybe saying, we need to focus on ourselves right now. The big issues, the planet stuff, it's just going to have to wait while we get back on our own 2 feet. But actually what I'm finding, both from sort of international surveys that are being carried out and sort of anecdotally from people that we work with on a daily basis, is that this is really at the top of the agenda right now. And I was just reading a report from Deloitte recently about, I think it covered about 2,000 executives in something like 21 countries, I think it was. Yeah. They were saying that environmental sustainability is the top issue that we're currently facing. Forget all the other stuff. This is the top one that we're currently facing. So I wondered how you're finding the growth of this as an issue, and whether or not the past year has actually represents an inflection point. Maybe people are starting to think differently about what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I don't just mean in sport, I mean across business and other sectors more generally.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think certainly I guess it's really positive to see that it's still high on people's agendas, and despite kind of, I suppose, the challenges that everyone's faced in their own different ways over the last year with COVID and everything, that actually that is still being seen as a kind of as an issue that needs addressing. And I think that's really encouraging because, like you, I suppose when this first started, it was uncertain how it was going to be viewed. Was it going to drop back down the agenda as obviously pressing issues such as the pandemic were coming to the fore? But it's great to see that that's not the case. And actually, I think the biggest thing that people is changing is this sort of perception of risk around sustainability and environmental issues across businesses, but I think in sport. And actually, it's no longer kind of the risk is of doing something. It's actually the risk of not doing something in this area. Mm-hmm. And so that real sort of switch on how people are are viewing risk and sustainability and environmental impact is a real bit game changing, actually, because now it's all about action as opposed to should we, shouldn't we, because they see it as a real risk to their business and they see it as a risk to their participation, to most of their stakeholders. I think, especially in sport, whether that stakeholder, if you're an event, that's the host city, or if it's, you know, athletes at your event, or members if it's a club level, whatever the case may be, this is high on individuals' agendas from a personal point of view, but it's also a risk in sport, and, you know, weather issues happening, washing out clubs, or washing, you know, there's financial implications. And I think actually that risk is becoming more proven in the literature, it's becoming more documented in the media, and therefore it's becoming kind of more front of mind, which is encouraging to see. But as we know in this space, there's still a long way to go and lots to learn.
And sorry, Toby, I don't think you quite were in the room when we were making our introductions. So I'll just sort of explain to people the third face that's appeared on the screen. So welcome to Toby Robbins from the British Association for Sustainability in Sport. I asked Joy to do something similar. Toby, maybe you could just quickly introduce yourself and maybe the work that BASIS, if you give people an idea of the work that BASIS does, if that would help.
Yeah, happily. I've been involved with BASIS from the outside, really, for about 10 years, insofar as I used to supply many of the members of BASIS. And it's only recently that I've really come on board and given them my time as part of the organisation. BASIS has set out as a network of elite organisations, essentially, all be that your MCCs and your horse racing and lawn tennis and your Arsenal and Principality Stadium. So a group of like-minded organisations, elite organisations and venues who absolutely wanted to address sustainability in sport and recognise that they had a role to play and an opportunity to really make a difference. So that's how it really sort of kicked off as a network of elite folks sharing best practice and really making a difference. As Joey just said, now it is just growing and growing. The interest in BASIS and the interest in actually addressing environmental sustainability and sustainability more broadly within organisations and within the sector is growing very, very rapidly now, and it's great to be able to support that. And so, from BASIS' point of view, the ability to put on more and more events and add greater and greater value, add best practice, share best practice, and really provide certification and support for organisations to really make a difference. Means it's a very exciting time for us at BASIS, and it's great to be part of. And clearly, of course, we'd be delighted to hear from more folks, to come on board. Picking up on what Joey said, though, earlier. On the questions really of sort of motivation and the risk management and so on, I couldn't help but feel that there is still a long way to go. And I think what stood out to me very recently was the the European Super League fiasco. Now, what that said to me about mindsets within boardrooms was that actually, it's Milton Friedman, neoliberal economics. Absolutely, how do we secure the revenue? It was absolutely profit driven for the stakeholders, for the owners of the business, rather than looking more broadly. And I think the lesson which the fan base gave back, that actually there's a social responsibility here, I thought was really, really interesting to actually see just how strong that was and how swiftly the clubs responded. But equally, very, very disturbing that hadn't been anticipated. So I do think that there's a long way to go. And certainly from the point of view of my sort of background as Chief Executive of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, absolutely looking at different sectors and assisting with business planning and taking things into account at that level, understanding what the motivations are for the boardroom to actually take environmental sustainability seriously and to actually address issues, understanding what those drivers are for them, I think is fertile territory for the sector. There's a lot of work which we can still do.
Yeah, and just thinking about some of those motivations, I mean, maybe I'm sort of coming at it with a slightly simplistic view, but it seems to me that there's a sort of moral case for taking an interest in this. It affects the planet. We're all part of it. We're all going to suffer, and we've all got a role to play through our different activities, our behaviour, our organisations, and that affects everybody generally. But in terms of and this probably answers why the sports sector is continuing to take this seriously despite all the other pressures on people's time and resources, and that's that it is directly impacting sports as we speak. And I just wonder if maybe you could offer some sort of examples of the types of impact that climate change, that environmental pressures are having on sports. And Joy, I'd also be really interested to hear from you as an athlete, because presumably you've competed around the world, you've experienced different conditions, and you know firsthand the sorts of impacts that it has on you as an athlete.
Yeah, I think there's lots of different, I suppose, levels in sport that you can look at this from. So I guess from my own personal experience, competing on an international level and in places like Australia and places like Argentina, where the heat is such a big factor. It breaks up the game. So if it's particularly hot days, that you end up breaking it down to quarters, you end up having more breaks. It breaks up the game, so it influences how you play the game. But in terms of like actual performance from a personal point of view, it just puts more stress on the athlete. So when you're operating in high temperatures, your concentration goes more easily, your coordination goes, things like that kind of ultimately impact the quality of what you can do, and therefore the quality of the game. And I think in that point, the heat can actually become a bit of a leveler. It's no longer about kind of who has the most skill, it's just who can deal with the heat better. And there's an element of that's the way sport is, and that's, you're playing in the environment, you have to deal with sport. But the more that we sort of stress that, and the more that those extreme temperatures become more extreme and more frequent, there's other examples. I think there was a marathon in New York not a couple of years ago that was cancelled because of the heat. That it's impacting different sports in different ways at high levels, but equally at lower level, like not lower levels, but more grassroots levels, it's also impacting. There's a report out there, if anyone else is interested in hearing a few more stats about this. I won't be able to reel them off right now, but the Hit for Six report and a Game Changers report as well, and check those out. And there's also another report, if I can just remind myself for what it was called. I think it was called Playing Against the Clock. That gives loads of examples of how, more extreme weather events or environmental changes are impacting athletes, are impacting clubs at grassroots level, and actually the financial implications, the performance implications, the kind of governance implications, like just the disruption that can cause is significant. And I think obviously from our point of view in the UK, we're quite blessed that we're perhaps not at the sharp end of those changes at the moment. When you look at countries like India, where air pollution is rife, or Australia, where heat is rife. But actually, if we do still look closer to home, those things are still happening. So there was also another report called Breathe GB, and that really sort of gave some facts and figures around how air pollution impacts children and their lung development, and how if we're wanting, as governing bodies, as clubs, we're wanting to grow our sport, we really want to be giving our kind of younger generation the best platform possible to be the best performers or participants that they can be. And actually, if we're stunting their lung growth because there's poor air pollution, then it's an impact for all people. So yeah. It's real.
Yeah, and there are certainly some sports sectors where the impact is more evident, be that the difficulty skiing if there is no snow, the difficulty playing on a links golf course is if it's been washed into the sea. As I see Susan's put up in the discussion, rowing clubs being flooded. And I'm sure all terrain, all weather pitches were created for a reason. It's it will increasingly impact more and more organisations. The heat, playing cricket is definitely a factor. Around the world as we've seen, and frankly, if you just look at the World Economic Forum's global risks report from Davos, 4 out of 5 of the top risks, most likely and most impactful risks are climate related and environment related. And the 5th one being infectious diseases, which is clearly fairly topical at the moment. Everyone's saying, this has got to be on your agenda. This needs to be right at the top of your agenda. I think increasingly the evidence is there. We're seeing that playing out.
And maybe actually this is an opportunity for some of the people who are on the call to maybe put in the comments box some of the impacts that they're feeling, because we've got people from NGBs, from associations, from local clubs who are at the sharp end of it. So please feel free to give us an indication in the Q&A as to the sorts of impacts you're feeling at the sharp end. But just go back to what you're saying there, Toby, about the sort of risk element. Are you finding that it is increasingly finding its way onto organisations' risk registers? Is it becoming a regular item on the agenda for board meetings? Because that would indicate that it's sort of front and centre of thinking, and that it represents I hesitate to use existential threat, but I imagine in some instances it could be deemed as an existential threat, given if it goes unaddressed.
Yes, a survey was actually done quite recently, which actually showed that the sports sector is lagging, I think it's fair to say, in terms of actually having sustainability on the agenda at board meetings. And I think some of that, it sort of harks back to me to what the drivers are for the business, and for the organisation, and what those, what imperatives the business is actually, responding to. You've mentioned there's a moral imperative. Now, clearly in a commercial organisation, you need to translate that into what the business impact of that is actually going to be. And I don't think it could be clearer than having a fan base. If society is demanding it, or society is the customer base. So failing to respond to that moral imperative when the whole customer base is impacted by it would seem to be a little short-sighted. But increasingly, there's another key driver, I think, for organisations to have it on the agenda, within board meetings, and that's the regulatory driver. There's more, and I often sort of recommend doing a pestle analysis and actually just looking at things from how's this going to impact on the business, politically, economically, socially, technologically, legislative, and environmentally. What are the impacts here? And you can look at any of those. The political mood is absolutely driving sustainability. So if you haven't got that on the agenda in your board meeting, then you are not responding to the external environment in which you are operating. If you haven't actually recognised that economically there will be increasing carbon taxes and green taxes and incentives to move away from operating your organisation in an environmentally less sustainable way, then you will lose out financially. So just actually running through that kind of analysis within the boardroom, and actually, absolutely should end up with environmental sustainability being on the agenda for every meeting, and supporting the facilities managers and the operating team to really start making a difference and putting a plan in place.
It's interesting that you mentioned the sort of regulatory pressure, and certainly in the commercial sector. The big uh, the big corporates, the big businesses in this country are now being asked to, they've got certain reporting requirements of their Section 172 obligations, one of which is the impact on the environment, the impact on society. So the big businesses are starting to have to think about how to do that. The Corporate Governance Code references these issues. The King 4 Code out of South Africa has done for quite a while. The Charity Governance Code references environmental impact. I think we heard this morning that there's a likelihood that the Code for Sports Governance may come to at least make some mention of it. So it's clearly something that's coming from that side of things. So there's like a moral case, there's a business case, and there's a regulatory case for, yeah, you're missing a trick. If this isn't on your agenda, if it isn't on your risk register, it really should be. And I'm just wondering as well, are you finding that organisations are collecting the right sort of data to be able to assess the impact? We see a couple of comments in the questions about the number. Our last two World Cups have been disrupted by extreme weather. So are people keeping tabs on, I guess in the worst case scenario, the amount of facility that they're losing, in the case of a links course or something like that, how many games or tournaments are being postponed or abandoned, and the sort of revenue implications for that? Is this something that organisations are keeping closer tabs on, do you find?
I think from a data point of view, I think it's something that, again, is probably traditionally not as widespread, but is growing as obviously this becomes more kind of in the conversation. People are wanting to measure this. So I guess from my point of view, where my role is from a Birmingham 2022 point of view, is to understand what the carbon footprint of that event is and understand where we can try and make reductions in carbon impact through our operations and stuff. Measurement is really crucial. And I think reporting plays a really key role in that. If you're committing to reporting, whether that's regulatory or voluntary reporting, which is still really important, the voluntary aspect is super important if you're not currently under any sort of regulatory commitments to do that beyond just obviously the compliance stuff, is super important because it just drives that conversation. It drives, okay, well, where are the opportunities? Where are the key hotspots where we can impact for our organisation? Is it in the transport element, or actually is it in the food procurement element, or what is it within our members? Do we need to engage our members if they're the key sort of stakeholder? Like how, and if you start to measure that, and then you start to measure impact, and you start to measure improvement, and actually the risks and the opportunities, then it really puts more weight behind the conversation. It doesn't just become a moral conversation or a regulatory conversation. It builds that business case to propel it forward. And I think data is something that, is super powerful, whether that's, data on financial impact, or whether that's actually, okay, what's our carbon impact as an organization? And there's more and more tools coming out now, open source tools that can help you do that. So they're coming out kind of thick and fast. People are sort of, that collaboration element is really coming to the fore in the sports sector. And there's also kind of lots of different people that can help you with that. But the measurement side is key to keeping it on the agenda and keeping progress, I suppose.
And sort of another part of the measurement consideration is, you as athletes, presumably NGBs, elite squad, elite performance teams are interested in, how their athletes are getting on. There's a duty of care element to it, and athlete well-being's rightly considered an important issue. So is this also something that are athletes being sort of questioned about how they're finding competing, how they're finding performance under these different conditions?
I think, I guess from personal experience, which I guess is the main one I can talk to from this point, is I'd say yes, like it's obviously a key factor, because as I mentioned before, like extreme heat, or if it's soaking wet because it's rainy, or that impacts performance. And when it's all about performance at the end of the day. Whether the link between that and bigger issues such as climate change or the bigger environmental issues, whether that link is happening as a live conversation, I think is something that perhaps needs to develop. But in terms of trying to prepare and adapt for the extreme that you might encounter when playing, there's definitely that element, because it's about performance and sport is about performance. So at kind of that end. And so, yeah, but I would say that the gap perhaps, or the area of exploration that'd be interesting is where's that link between that instance of performance in that competition versus the longer term trend of climate change and that less tangible, I suppose, link.
Yeah. And Toby, just thinking about some of the other pressures, and again, I'm going to go slightly outside the sector for this one. And in the commercial sector, again, we can see, divestment of certain portfolios. You can see pressure from, if an big institutional investor, say like BlackRock, decides that it's going to adopt a particular stance on something, then that has such a knock-on effect. So you can see companies now being sort of expected to adopt particular stances on ESG issues, report on them, live up to those commitments. Do you think we can are we or can we get to the same sort of situation in the sports sector where sponsors, commercial partners are also starting to play an important role in helping or driving sports organizations to make this a
I think what I pick up on from the likes of BlackRock's divestment announcement is the leadership element. That is such a clear statement to the world that, okay, we've done all the analysis, we are as financial as it gets, and we know that we need to be responding here and we need to be showing leadership. This isn't about short-term profit. This needs to happen, and we are stepping up to the plate and reacting, responding to that. I think that the power that sport has is absolutely phenomenal. To many football fans, it's a religion. It's the nearest thing to a religion for them. And if their club says this is what you should be doing and demonstrates that leadership, the impact, I think, is absolutely unimaginable. It is huge. And that is the opportunity which I think sport has to influence society, to actually drive the agenda forward and demonstrate that leadership. I think it's such an exciting place to for a sports club to actually find itself. So if the board actually take the trouble to understand the agenda and understand what the opportunity is for them as a governing body, as a club, and to actually then think, what can we actually do about this? I think they will realise the influence they can have is just so huge that it's almost a crime not to. It's just such an exciting opportunity. Leadership.
Yeah, and to pick up on that leadership point, I think, absolutely. I think that leadership point is crucial, because the leadership doesn't just have to come in sort of big statements in the media. Leadership can come from asking your suppliers what they're doing and asking an athlete what they think. The leadership can come in small bites as well as big bites, and actually all those smaller elements add up. So if, I think there was a comment around bridging the kind of making it more aware in terms of facilities management. And if there's a bit of leadership, a bit of training in that, or if there's just a bit of questioning around this bit, then you can take that small steps of leadership as well as the big claims that the BlackRocks of the world make. And that influence really percolates out across the whole industry. If you're, just even putting a minimum standard against your suppliers in this area, or, taking into account different viewpoints and understanding where the biggest elements of change can be, and then making a small step to do something about that. It's
and being seen how are we
Joey,
actually operating our facilities, our stadiums? Yeah, so there's clear messaging in that. Yeah, absolutely. It might be sustainable food sourcing. It might be the switch to renewable energy. It might be electric charging in the car parks and so on, sorting out public transport. There are so many areas that where there's the opportunity for saying, look at what we're doing here. And for posting, this is the amount of waste we're recycling. This is the type of cutlery and so on. We switch to for environmental reasons, be it biodegradable, whatever. To actually demonstrate that leadership so that everybody, all the fans can see, that this isn't just words. This is put into action, and I absolutely accept that there is a requirement for expertise to actually know what can be done. I've seen some of the discussion points, and I'd absolutely be hugely enthusiastic to have the sports stars, let's say your Marcus Rashfords and so on of this world, stepping up, because what that actually does in terms of engaging the whole community is phenomenal. So I'm Joey mentioned the in terms of measuring footprints and things like that. Absolutely, it does start with measurement, but you also need to know what to measure. Forgive the shameless plug here, but Basis is a damn good place to start for that. It's. And in terms of actually teaching best practice and sharing best practice and giving that kind of guidance. That's shameless plug out of the way. But the opportunity is there. It's and the help is there. And please just reach out and show that leadership. Get it on the agenda in the boardroom. Get it filtering through to the whole operation. Get it out to the fans and the whole community, so everyone can see what you're doing.
I'm conscious that we have a range of organisations represented in the audience today. We, like I said, we have some of the big NGBs that will be hosting large scale events. We'll have some local organisations, all sort of wondering, all asking for sort of advice on what they can do. So, if we just start at a sort of general level, what advice would you give to an organisation looking to place this issue at the heart of its strategic thinking and its decision making? I'm assuming that the earlier the better. Baking it into long-term planning is going to yield sort of better results than sort of coming to it quite late. I may have misunderstood it in a previous interview that you did, Joey, about I think one of the World Cups that you came to. You felt that you maybe came to it quite late in the day in terms of influencing suppliers and sponsors. Perhaps you've had a longer run up in the Commonwealth Games, but presumably that length of time to be able to plan ahead and to make it a central plank thinking rather than an afterthought. And I don't mean it was in those other things that you worked on, but how would you go about setting this issue at the heart of planning?
Earlier the better, because I think environmental sustainability touches kind of every part of the organisation.
We may have lost the sound on you there, Joey. Is that?
Have you got me back?
Is that at our end or yours?
I'm not sure. Toby, can you hear me?
Or is it just me? I can hear you fine, Joey.
Toby's nodding like he can hear Joey, but I don't know.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
All right, it's me then. Sorry for the interruptions. It's something at my end. I do apologise.
No worries. I was just saying, I guess, earlier is always better, because I guess from an environmental sustainability point of view, it realistically does kind of touch every part of the organisation, whether that is, procurement, performance, food, employees, what their personal kind of, it percolates all the way through. So if you can have that baked in early and it becomes part of the culture and it becomes part of the way that things get done, so it becomes a standard kind of question or it becomes a standard consideration, then that means that some of the barriers that people kind of associate around environmental sustainability in organizations, costs, coming in too late, it can't really influence things, they kind of get mitigated more. And I suppose having from a board level point of view, having a sort of top management sponsor really helps. So you don't have to necessarily start with getting the full board on side straight away, but if you can find someone on the board who has an interest in this stuff or can is willing to support this stuff, then that's a really good place to start, and you can really start exploring those conversations. So that's also a great place to start. And I think then it's just understanding what who your stakeholders are, which is an exercise you'll do anyway, and how this stuff influences them and how they influence the environmental sustainability and how it matters to them. And then you start to build that case of this is something we cannot not do. And this is the reason why. And then as I say, some of the barriers is, it might cost a lot, or some of this, it's just baking it in. So a lot of the things happen anyway. So if you can kind of factor in a sustainability just as part of the culture, part of the regular process, that's where it becomes sort of really impactful and really embedded, as opposed to just like an add-on, which, like you say, Craig, was one of my experiences and learning from, say, my experience of the Hockey World Cup, where I sort of asked the question around sustainability maybe 9 months out, and actually it's just too late. A lot of stuff has already happened. So the earlier you can get it in there, the better. And across all stakeholders. So someone's put in the chat around an environmental champion on the board. Yeah, exactly. But also environmental champions in your staff cohort, in your is there an athlete that you're aware of that might take an interest in this stuff in your sport, and how can you support them in voicing that? I think that communication bit is really important and really impactful to show leadership, but some people can be hesitant around like, oh, well, we're reducing single-use plastics, but someone's going to criticize that we're flying 10 athletes around the world, or, we're laying down a new all-weather plastic pitch, and people just see, and want to criticize. So being transparent, being open, being willing to learn, but being really clear about what you're trying to do, and it might not be perfect, is also super important to just keep on that progressive journey. Toby, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I'm just delighted you put transparency in there. I think that's absolutely critical, and not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. I remember having that conversation regarding flights with Premier League football club, and they said, look, it's a matter of security. We don't actually have a choice on that. Well, that's great. Okay, so at the moment there is no choice. We understand that. Let's just be transparent about it. We can't do everything, but there's plenty we can do. And I would absolutely say that that it has to start at the top. It has to start in the boardroom, and because that sets the tone for the whole organisation. If the chief exec is bought in, if the board, the message from the board is this is happening, then it's happening. It means it's not just an add-on, or I've got to try and do this around my day-to-day job. It is actually part of the business plan. It is structured, it is measured, and it is delivered just like any other program. That board level engagement, I think, is critical. Frankly, that move away from Friedman's neoliberal, money. Actually, this is needed on for so many reasons, and absolutely, it's what the fan base, it's what the staff, it's what players and sports people will all be demanding. Anybody who looks at the issue, it has to be part of the agenda. Start at the top and be transparent.
And if we start at the top, maybe just think in terms of starting from the beginning. Obviously, a lot of people are interested in the sort of practical applications, things that they can actually do. Where do you find, let's assume we're starting reasonably from scratch, where might the biggest gains be in terms of behaviour? The behaviours that have the biggest impact. When I was talking to you the other day, Toby, I sort of rather naively said, that working from home and not printing things out at work was helping. And I think you said, well, that's I may have misunderstood, but you sort of suggested that in the great scheme of things, whether or not I print out a couple of pages of paper probably isn't going to have the biggest impact.
Yeah, my master's degrees have both been on systems thinking and recognizing that actually knowledge is required. It isn't just a matter of actually using recycled paper, because frankly that recycled paper might have been shipped from Brazil or China with a greater environmental impact than if you'd sourced a local sustainably forested product. So having a depth of knowledge, having the expertise, reading into the subject, and recognizing absolutely that perfect should not be the enemy of the good, should be part of the thinking. And in terms of engagement, actually having those kind of discussions within the organization. This is what we're thinking of switching to recycled paper. Is this a good idea? Well, actually, reduction absolutely has to come first, on the waste hierarchy. Being open, transparent, engaging everybody in that discussion is a great place to start, and a really motivating thing for everybody within the organisation. People want to work for responsible organisations. There are so many surveys out there showing that, and so ignoring this issue is insane. And engaging people actually is a wonderful opportunity to make your organisation a better place for everybody to work in.
I think I know the answer to the next question. I think we've covered it in part anyway, but sport gets asked to do an awful lot, doesn't it, in sort of educational, economic, health, criminal justice, all sorts of things. Is it right for sport to take leadership on this issue? Like I say, I think I know what your answer is going to be, but for the avoidance of doubt, I'll ask it anyway. Should sport take leadership in this? And as a sort of addition to that question, is there a role here for the funding bodies? We heard this morning that the Code for Sports Governance may make reference to this to be properly addressed by organisations. The funding councils obviously oversee large investments of public money. Should those investments come with some sort of parameters around the way in which it's spent with this issue in mind, or is that something that should be out of their remit?
I think I think it does come under the to take, I guess, the second part of the question first. It does come under the remit of the funding bodies, definitely. Going back to that commercial aspect, if it's baked in, then that's the signal to the sector that's the direction of travel, that's the strategic direction, and actually get on board, or it's a real financial risk for you. So there's a real sort of lever that can play in terms of sport, and alongside all the other issues or opportunities that sport is asked to sort of contribute to. I would say that it absolutely, unsurprisingly, absolutely has a role to play in this, but not because of in and of itself, not because of environmental sustainability. It is in and of itself important, but because it crosses all those other issues as well. It's a fundamental part of health and well-being. If the environment's poor, that's going to impact your health and well-being. If there's an issue around social cohesion or real kind of social togetherness, sport can play a big part in that. And if there's that community feel, people will want to look after that community, of which the environment is part of it. So I think to think of environmental sustainability in isolation from all those other different important opportunities and issues is a bit of a miss. I think incorporating it as how it can both sort of enhance and complement those things as well.
To see what Marcus Rashford's done on the free school meals. Yeah, absolutely. Sport needs such an opportunity to lead.
Thank you. I think we're close to the end of time, and I guess I've got one question, which hopefully will be a relatively straightforward one, and I'll ask it to both of you at the same time, and that is, are you hopeful going forward? Are you hopeful for the future in terms of what can be achieved and the role that sport can play in achieving that?
I'll go first and I'll let... yeah, I think I am hopeful. I think, to be honest, we have to be hopeful because we're not going to do anything or get there otherwise. And I am hopeful in terms of the fact that, going back to this, where we started this webinar, and in the fact that this is still, environmental sustainability is still high on the agenda despite the challenges and disruption that we've had over the year, is something to be hopeful for. But the other great case studies and examples that are happening across the sector, and the fact that it's in our gift to start having more of these conversations, yeah, I'm for sure.
Absolutely. And one of the other reasons for my being as hopeful and enthusiastic as I am is the level of engagement, the increasing level of engagement with BASIS. So another shameless plug, do please reach out to us and see if we can help you. We are together all making a difference here and supporting sport in becoming sustainable. So yeah, very hopeful. It's got to be done, and we've got a great opportunity.
Good, excellent. That's great to hear. And how can organisations get in touch with BASIS?
Basis.org.uk website, great place to start.
So the trick question.
And frankly, one can just register for newsletters and so on, and that will start to inform and share knowledge, and clearly we can discuss membership more fully, but frankly just registering as for the newsletter would be a great place to start. So yeah, basis.org.uk. Look forward to seeing you all there. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I think it's such an important issue, and so I'm really pleased that we've had an opportunity today to discuss it. Toby, I have to give additional thanks to you for stepping in quite last minute. I guess Monday morning, this wasn't how you expected you'd be spending your Wednesday afternoon, but that's how it turned out. So thank you so much
It's
for
been a real pleasure
digging us out of that particular hole. I really do appreciate you stepping in very late. Oh, thank you. And thank you to Joy. Thank you for your insights as well. And
no, pleasure.
I think we've answered quite a few of the questions that have come in, but obviously if people want to get in touch with either the SGA or with Joey or Toby and the work that's going on at BASIS, please feel free to do that. But thank you, both of you, for a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
And I think we're now ready to move on to our next session. Again, we're in a couple of minutes over there, and we're returning to the issue of resilience. This is obviously a resilience issue on a grand scale, but we're looking at resilience at the organisational level now. And I'm really pleased that Kirsten Fazy is joining us. And if you think you're busy, then spare a thought for Kirsten, who is currently not only working at British Triathlon, helping with their organisational and governance setup, but she's also currently finishing her PhD on organisational resilience in elite sport, and she's going to share some of the findings of that research with us shortly. I think she's just in the process of joining.
Hopefully I'm here already, Craig, if other people can hear me, so I can certainly see you.
You are. Excellent. Yeah, I can now see you. You were a black box for a moment, but now you're a human, which is good to see. So you're going to take us through some of your findings as part of your research and as part of working with elite organisations, but I'm sure these are all issues that can be transferred to all
Yeah, exactly. And thanks for that, Craig, and thanks for the introduction. So yes, I have been for about the last 3.5 years been devoting my life to looking at organisational resilience in elite sport. When I talk about elite sport, I mean sort of professional sport organisations or national governing bodies. But a lot of what you're about to hear about is applicable to grassroots organisations, community sport organisations, and teams within organisations. It's not just at a strategic level, and also a lot of it to business more generally. Without further ado, I will share my screen if that's okay. And let me just find the right window. And I'm hoping now that you'll all be able to see that. So thanks ever so much for the Sports Governance Academy for inviting me along today. As I say, Kirsten Fazy. If anybody has got any questions after this or they want to reach out to me at all, then LinkedIn is probably the best way. It's one of the advantages of having a really annoying surname that nobody can spell, is that if you do manage to spell it correctly, I'm quite easy to search for in these kinds of environments. So what I want to talk today about is organisational resilience. And when I talk about that, people sort of go a bit blank. And so whenever we're talking about resilience, whether it's resilience of an athlete, resilience of a team, resilience of an individual, whatever it might be, we're always talking about some kind of significant, unexpected or disruptive event and some kind of positive or better than expected outcome. And the reason why we thought it might be necessary to look at it in sport organisations, and it hasn't been looked at previously prior to this PhD, is because of the number of events that can impact sport organisations. So we've got funding cuts or huge swings occasionally in funding that can be quite unexpected. We've got often quite a lot of turnover in key staff, perhaps happens a bit more in sport organisations than your average business. Obviously, there are all kinds of issues, reputational threats in the media, which, because of the interest in sport, can perhaps have a bit more attention than they might do in other environments. And then I'm going to win an award, I think, for the earliest time within a presentation to mention the C word. Obviously, the coronavirus has been a huge, significant disruption, not just to sport organisations, but to pretty much every business on the planet. So those are the kind of things that organisations have to deal with that they need to be resilient to. So I just wanted, in this slide, I'm not going to talk today about all of my PhD studies, and nor am I going to go into too much depth on geeking out about sort of methodologies and so on. But the point of this slide is simply to emphasise that the work that I'm about to share with you has come from data that's deeply embedded from people within sports organisations, and there have been various sort of rigorous academic processes. It's very easy in the media and so on for people to bandy around their expertise on resilience, but it's so that there's a bit more depth behind the findings that I'm going to share with you. I'm particularly going to talk about studies 1 and 2. So study 1, all the information I'll share around definitions and these sort of 5 key characteristics that have come out are from something called the Delphi method. And it's an online collaborative tool to help bring a panel of experts towards a consensus in a particular area. And in this case, we had 62 experts from across a wide range of about 60 different sports, and they had about 700 years of experience between them, as well as quite a few prominent, well-published academics, all contributing across a 7-month period to various online surveys and opinion pieces that we asked them about. So as you say, that's just that won't come through necessarily in what I'm presenting, but that gives you the depth behind the research. And then the other study that I'm going to come on and talk about, which is about the mechanisms, the processes, what organisations are doing to help them be resilient, comes from longitudinal interviews. So by that, I mean, I went and spoke to, it was 21 different individuals, quite senior level, and then often somebody else within about 10 different sport organisations. And I spoke to them a couple of times across a 4 to 6 month period to get that really rich data, which again, the findings have come from. I've just put on the slide, I've mentioned that I've also done an ethnography and some action research with some interventions where I've had to put my money where my mouth is and actually go and see how this plays out within sport organisations, and also implementing strategies to improve organisational resilience. As I say, I don't have time to talk about those today, but it's just to explain that there is that other work lying beneath this. So without further ado, within the first study, we were looking at a definition of organisational resilience that this panel of experts, 62 people, sort of got on board with, and they looked at various options and various nuances, and we constructed this definition of organisational resilience as a dynamic capability of an organisation to successfully deal with significant change. This is what we're talking about. So that successfully deal with significant change bit, that's the resilience, that's there being some event, a change, and that there's a better than expected or successful outcome. But the important bit there also is that it's a dynamic capability. Dynamic meaning anybody can develop it. You can always get better. You'll never be best. You'll probably never be worst. But all organisations can improve their resilience. And it's a capability, which means we're not talking about the outcome, what happens when an organisation has dealt with a significant change and it's come out the other end, everything's fine, and they're feeling very smug and happy with themselves, because that's not real life. Changes are impacting organisations all the time, and therefore you never get to that end point where you've kind of resumed functioning, phew, everything's great. Instead, this is talking about a dynamic capability. It's forward looking. It's, could you deal with the next problem? If something else hit you right now, would you be in a position to deal with it? Because we've all, I think, worked in organisations where you might have just about dealt with something through the skin of your teeth, but you think, I really hope nothing else hits us right now, because we would really struggle. So if it's a resilient organisation, it's one that can deal with what's coming around the corner. And then the second part of that definition is talking about it emerges from multi-level interacting characteristics and processes. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because people sometimes struggle when you talk about an organisational thing. People think, well, what are you actually talking about? Because our organisation is just a bunch of people. And definitions of organisations are a bunch of people with specific tasks, often divided into teams, and it's about how tasks are allocated and how those groups communicate. So it's really important to acknowledge within this that an organisation might do things, there might be processes and policies that are set, but also a huge part of organisational resilience is about what the teams are doing, and really importantly, what the individuals within that organisation are doing. So I don't want to lose sight of the individual factor in it. This is a bit fast and quick. I wanted to cover a lot and sort of give a lot of information out in this. If anybody wants, either got particular questions on particular things, you can ask them at the end, or as I say, get in touch with me. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. So when we looked at the characteristics that resilient organisations have, we came up with these 5 key characteristics. So we're talking about structural clarity. Structural clarity is quite an organisational level thing. It's about understanding how the communication flows within your organisation. It's about understanding roles and responsibilities, how they're divided between individuals and teams. And it's about decision making. But the important bit is not just that there is a structure, but that it's clear. So people within the business and also externally understand how communication flows, how they get hold of information, on what basis decisions are going to be made. So it's that clarity aspect. The second part, in terms of an ability to successfully deal with significant change, is flexible improvement. That's the terminology for sort of the culture or the mindset of always seeking, striving to get better, to do things better, but to always be flexible and adaptable along the way, recognizing they're going to have to be changes, but really valuing learning and innovation, which is something that I think sport organisations are actually really good at. Then the third key characteristic is about shared understanding. So we've got structural clarity, that's the sort of structural organisational level. We've got kind of a culture or a mindset thing around flexible improvement. Shared understanding is about the direction of travel. So it's understanding what are the vision and the values of the organisation, where are we going? But more importantly than that, it's about having a collective belief in your ability to get there. So you believe that your colleagues and your teams and the people around you all together are heading in a particular direction, and that's the way you're going to go and you're going to achieve those goals. Then the next one, reciprocal commitment, is kind of the effective emotional part of this ability to successfully deal with significant change. And this is the feeling that that between an employer and an employee, and also between employees, that there is trust and support and value and psychological safety within the organisation, which allows you to make mistakes, be adaptable, to try to get better and successfully deal with significant change without always worrying about whether you're going to be supported and safe in that environment. And then the fifth one of these key characteristics is around operational awareness. And this is about being able to understand, identify and assess the range of options that might be available to you when you're faced with a significant change, and the different ways that you might be able to deal with that. And the way that's achieved is through understanding the operating environment, and really importantly, what are the available resources? What might I be able to call upon? Who might I be able to call upon who might help with this particular problem? And we'll come on to that more in a minute, because it's very related to one of the processes. So that's a real whistle-stop tour of study one. We've looked at a definition of organisational resilience, which has been endorsed by this panel of 62 experts working within sport and with academia. And then we've got these 5 key characteristics or pillars of organisational resilience. Those are what resilient organisations look like. And then I'm going to come on to study 2, which is the mechanisms, the processes. This is how resilient organisations function. And at this point, I would normally look around the room and see if people are smiling and nodding and generally interested, taking notes, people falling asleep, people checking their emails. And it's just the bizarrest thing, as I'm sure all of you on this call will have experienced, when I'm just talking to my screen. And I've got no idea whether anybody's interested in this. So I will happily plough on and gladly assume that, that everybody's smiling and nodding in an engaged manner. So study 2 was about mechanisms. This is about the processes. What are resilient organisations doing which help them to successfully deal with significant change? And within this study 2, which was from these longitudinal interviews across a 4 to 6 month time period with various people working across 10 different sport organisations, we've got 2 core processes, which I've termed sensing and adapting. And then we've got 2 supporting processes, which are termed strengthening and shielding. And the idea is that sensing and adapting are these kind of processes that are going on all the time, constantly feeding into one another. It's not as though one happens and then the other one takes over. These are the 2 things that organisations are doing to be resilient. But in order, if you remember, resilience is, under this definition, is this capability, this kind of forward-looking thing. So in order to be resilient in the future, an organisation or the people within it need to be constantly thinking about how to strengthen the resources within that organisation to deal with problems when they emerge. But also shielding is this other supporting process. So again, this isn't about actually dealing with the problem, but it's about making sure that the organisation doesn't have too many problems to deal with in the first place. Because again, we've probably, if you've worked in a slightly more chaotic organisation compared to a better governed organisation, you might find, within the chaotic ones, it just feels like you're constantly fighting fires and you can't really do anything else. So that shielding process is to make sure that, the fires that you're fighting are the ones you've really got to fight. So I'll go through each of these and we'll leave some time at the end to go through some practical implications of this research. So some ideas of the kind of things that you might be able to do within your organisation to help develop that organisational resilience. So when I'm talking about sensing, this is about connecting decision makers within the organisation to the information which could impact those decisions. When I'm talking about decision makers, I don't mean necessarily the very senior leadership team within an organisation, because in a resilient organisation, decision making is quite spread out, and there are people at every level making all kinds of decisions all the time. And so this is the idea that people who are working to make decisions understand and hear the information that is going to be relevant to them that could impact those decisions. And in our research, people talk to us about 3 different areas that were important for being able to sense what's going on and get that information. So one is about internal and external connecting mechanisms. And I've got quite a nice little quote here. This was from one of the CEOs I spoke to. They were talking about having set up an employee forum. And it's saying that they help the management team see some of the risks at a lower level, which are often about pressures of time, pressures on people, mindset, mental state of some people that I wouldn't normally see or get close to. So that was an example of an internal connecting mechanism, which helped, in that case, the more senior decision makers to get information from other parts of the organisation. There are other examples that can be used, for example, relationship networks, role-specific forums, cross-sport mentoring. I know there's the Huddle, for example, on the Sports Governance Academy website. So that's a perfect example of people sharing information externally, being able to sense some stuff. There might be some rule changes, something that people need to know about, maybe something about the code of governance changes, just getting that heads up to understand what's happening in their environment. So that was one part of sensing. Then the other two parts, we've got diversity. I'm talking about something slightly different here. I'm not talking about demographic diversity. I'm talking about cognitive diversity. The two often go hand in hand because people's life experiences will often feed into how they see the world. But the important point for sensing is to have that cognitive diversity, people able to approach issues from different viewpoints and assess and evaluate them from different viewpoints, which then comes into the third part of sensing. It is that evaluation. So this is not somebody sitting there taking this information and deciding what to do with it. It's really important, the kind of the interperson evaluation. So discussing it and trying to understand, what's this information telling us? Do we need to do something in response to this? And then it's about monitoring. And again, this is something, because I say that this isn't a one-off, you don't sense and adapt and then you're done. When you make decisions, you then need to monitor them and evaluate them, because they will be unintended consequences. Leaders do not have a crystal ball. Any decision makers do not have a crystal ball, and you cannot accurately predict everything that will happen as a consequence of the decisions you make. So it's just accepting that, which I think on its own can relieve people with quite a lot of responsibility, thinking you make the best decision you can, but then what's really important is to sense, to monitor for unintended consequences after decisions have been made, so that then you can adapt further as necessary in relation to things that have happened that weren't quite what you were anticipating. That's sensing. So then going on to the second core process of a resilient organisation, which is about adapting. And this sort of goes backwards and forwards with sensing, and it's about ongoing iterative resilience processes in which changes and significant changes are constantly being sensed and adapted to, rather than there being like a big, strategic 5-year plan at the outset, which is necessary for the vision and values, but thinking that you can predict everything that's going to happen and then you just sort of set the wheels in motion and it's all going to go along quite smoothly, because it won't. And this was acknowledged in a nice quote here from it was a finance director of one of the organisations I spoke to. He was talking here about Olympic and Paralympic organisations, saying you set a path over the 4 years, but you absolutely know you're going to have storms along the way, changes you have to make, and it's almost inbuilt. The organisation has to be resilient in the normal sense, because there's no way you can do anything but be flexible and make changes and adjust as you go along. And I would say actually that isn't necessarily absolutely normal within all organisations, let alone sport organisations. But I think there probably is more of a recognition of the need and a willingness to be adaptable within sport organisations. So as you say, it's these constant tweaks and adjustments rather than you're trying to avoid any big wholesale changes. And there were two sort of smaller parts within this adapting process. One is about open and frequent communication. So that's the idea that this facilitates trust, and it helps keep the information circulating in a timely manner. But really importantly, it brings people along with what you're trying to do. So instead of announcing decisions once they've been made, if people understand that those discussions have been ongoing, they understand the options, and then they understand why a change or an adaptation might have to be made, then they're more likely to go along with it than if it suddenly comes out of the blue and everything's kept very close to your chest. So it's this open and frequent communication. And the second bit is about, sorry, I've completely lost my train of thought for 2 seconds there. Sorry, it's about mirroring current resource availability. Everybody does that, right? This is the idea that you might need to change what you're doing because you've got inputs of finance and people and so on. And then if those inputs change within an organisation, you need to adapt to that and change your expected output. And one of the most likely breaking points and therefore least resilient organisations are the ones where they try and keep doing the same. They don't adapt to this change in circumstances. So you try and produce the same outputs for less money, less people, and that's going to lead to problems further down the line. And it's going to mean that the next thing that comes along, you're less likely to be resilient, less likely to be able to deal with it. So as I say, it's about changing according to the resources that are available. So we've got these two core processes of sensing and adapting, and then we've got two supporting processes within resilient organisations, which is about strengthening resources and then about shielding. So in terms of strengthening, it's about building and strengthening. We're mainly talking here about financial, human and relational resources. And the points that came out of this were about spare capacity. So it's not about overall quantity of resources. It's not about the number of bums on seats or the amount of money coming in necessarily. There probably has to be a minimum number. But actually, the more money you have, the more people you have, the more challenging it might be to actually be really nimble and agile and sense and adapt to what's going on. What matters is having a bit of a buffer there, whether it's the finance or whether it's about people having a bit of spare capacity to be able to think about some of this stuff instead of always running at 110 miles an hour. So strengthening resources is about freeing up a bit of spare capacity. It's about the quality of those resources and in particular human resources. And there was a lot of discussion within the interviews that I did about how you go about improving the quality of human resources. And it's things like exposure to challenging scenarios so that people get more comfortable with dealing with change and more confident in their ability and their team's ability to do so. And it might be about virtual exposure, so learning from others, things like that, which I'll come on to more in the practical implications. So in relation to this supporting process of strengthening resources, we've got spare capacity is important, the quality of the resources is important, and relational resources are important. And in relation to relational resources, that is just people, organisations that you know, that you have a good relationship with, and really importantly, ones that you can then call upon in times of adversity, who might be able to give you access to other resources that they have. And this, again, I've got a quote here from different CEO this time, who was talking about if we're slightly isolated on our own and we're a small organisation trying to stay afloat, but trying to forge ahead as well, you can find yourself struggling a little bit or treading water. But if you've got partners and they needn't be in the same sports sphere, they can sometimes take some of that load off. And there were lots of examples people gave me within sport of the kind of partnerships that they developed where they could spread that kind of that load so that when they needed to call upon those extra resources, they'd be available. And then the final bit that I'm going to be talking about before I go on to the practical implications in this section is this second supporting process of shielding. And this has two elements. It's got internal and external shielding. So what do I mean by that? When I'm talking about internal shielding, this is Sports Governance Academy stuff, right? And their website is brilliant in terms of the resources that are available to help organisations essentially run the business a bit better. You're talking about risk registers there, you're talking about budgeting, decision-making structures, processes, stakeholder engagement, succession planning. So this is Code of Governance, Sports Governance Academy. That's all these internal shielding processes to try and minimise the amount of turbulence and upheaval you have from internally. But then people often don't think about the external shielding, which means that organisations aren't just sitting there passively waiting for things to happen to them. Sometimes that'll be the case. Coronavirus is an excellent example. You know, not a lot any of us could have really done about that. But sometimes there will be an ability to influence external partners, and therefore it's important for people within sport organisations to have, you know, perhaps board members or other people who are working within European, international sporting bodies able to lobby from within, stakeholder organisations. There might be people who work in clubs and who do volunteering, and at all those levels you're influencing other people and other environments beyond the organisation, but ultimately it can help with things like how rules and regulations might be developed, changes in governance structures, how policies are implemented, and all those things might mean that you get a smoother ride for your organisation. So again, apologies, a bit of a whistle-stop tour through that. That was the second study. So that came from longitudinal interviews, and that was looking at the mechanisms of organisational resilience. So I'm going to finish up here and then hopefully leave some time for questions and answers. Sorry, that was I've just clicked on that. That's an example of somebody saying why they needed to shield, which is giving an example of when they'd really struggled and had to stop everything they wanted to do in order to deal with a problem. I'm going to finish up with some practical examples here of ways to improve organisational resilience. And then what I'm really hoping is that at the end of this, I'm going to get off screen sharing and I'm going to find there are still some people in the room virtually. So there's just 4 suggestions here in terms of how to improve organisational resilience. There are so many things that can be done in this space. And as I say, I've worked with a particular sport organisation previously to try and implement and measure some changes in organisational resilience. But there's so many different things you can do, and it really depends on what the strengths and weaknesses of a particular organisation are as to what might be the best areas to address. But the 4 that I'll mention are exposure to challenging scenarios. This was the bit that I mentioned about strengthening human resources. We often think about it in terms of athletes, in terms of, going to increasingly intense competitions. You wouldn't directly put an athlete into some really high stake competition. You do it more gradually and make sure they had support along the way. Well, that can apply to anybody within your business, within your workforce, where you don't keep them within their comfort zone. You make sure that they're constantly exposed to different scenarios or different situations, but making sure they've always got the support behind them to deal with that. And then you increase the quality of their ability to deal with significant change when it comes along. Second suggestion, this is pointing to structural clarity. So that's one of those very first key characteristics I went through. And it's about roles and responsibilities audit. So within an organisation, people come and go, and depending on the skill set of a person, what they're actually doing day to day might be quite different to what their job description is or what everybody thought they were going to be doing when they came in. They're really good at some stuff. Somebody else has taken off some other stuff because they weren't so good at that. So it's sitting down and saying, okay, what do people actually within our team actually do? Who does what? And making sure there's clarity both within the team and to the wider organisation of who is responsible for what, because you might think it's obvious, but often it's not. So that helps with structural clarity. Scenario planning is a big one that I think can really help with organisational resilience. This is when you get a group of people together, and it might be in a particular team, or it's even better if it can be from across a range of different teams within an organisation, who sit down and take a problem, a potential scenario that's been worked up that might hit the organisation, and all work through what they'd actually do in that situation. And there's 2 things why this is 2 areas that this hits. One is the outputs. So you might end up with, let's say, a crisis comms plan, or some different decision-making process register, or there might be some things that you think, oh, actually, we need that to be more structured. But people forget about the sort of the softer skills that you develop just going through that kind of exercise, where you learn about the strengths and weaknesses of different people from across the organisation, how they handle pressure, and then you end up, hopefully, with a better sense of collective efficacy, group belief in the ability of your teammates to deal with that particular scenario. And then the 4th one I'm going to mention before I wrap up is about mapping relationship networks. So this is this idea, again, it's about strengthening relational resources in this case, but also about shielding, this idea of external influencing. And it's thinking about who, both internally and externally, do I need to have a really strong relationship with, from a strategic point of view or from a sensing day-to-day conversation point of view, because we often spend a lot of our time in terms of, the amount of communication backwards and forwards with either people we enjoy talking to, or those people who suck up all our time, and they may not be the people we need to be spending time with. So it's looking at who do I actually spend a lot of time with, and who should I be spending a lot of time with in developing those relationships. So that's just some of many, many ideas about developing organisational resilience in elite sport, but in other sport organisations as well. Thanks ever so much for listening. There's the email address if you want to get in touch by email, which is kirsten.fazy@ntu.ac.uk, or, as I say, happy to accept any LinkedIn requests as well. Right. Sorry. This is now me going to be seeing how to go back to the main menu. So let's go and...
Okay, yeah, we've got some questions coming in. I think for me, maybe I shouldn't be surprised by this, but looking at your definition of resilience, the thing that just occurred to me is that it's quite non-judgmental in the sort of change that it relates to. I think in my head, I see resilience as responding to adversity, but it seems from your definition that it's responding to change, good or bad. Is that right?
Yeah, so when we talk about resilience at an individual level, a lot of people often talk about adversity, negativity, bad events, if you like. I think generally that mood is shifting a little bit, but even more so at the organisational level. So at the organisational level, who decides whether something's good or bad, right? So you've got people in the room, and some people might see things positively, some people might see things negatively, but so many changes can be also regarded both ways. So they'll often present opportunities as well as threats. Now, some people talk about resilience as including sort of people who thrive and who develop opportunities. I personally think that's something slightly different. That's about growth and about, organisational functioning. Resilience is about overcoming these challenges. But the point is that we try and move away from talking about negativity, because most types of change will involve positives and negatives, opportunities and threats.
Even in sort of what we've seen over the last year or so, I think you would have been hard pressed to find an organisation that had planned for this level of disruption for this amount of time. But within that, people have pivoted to some. And there's a question just coming from Terry about innovation in resilience, and we've seen all sorts of innovations over the last 12 months or so. So I just wondered. So Terry asked quite specifically, did you consider a role of innovation, and is that something that came through in the research?
Yeah, so it's kind of incorporated in this characteristic of sort of flexible improvement, although that's more about learning and getting better rather than innovating. And I think we've got to be really careful. It's so easy, and this is why I stressed the sort of the academic rigor of this work, is that when people bandy these words around, they can use it to mean anything that's good. So people talk about resilient organisations are ones that are just good and that function well. Resilience is more specific than that. So it's not about innovation. That might be a byproduct. A resilient organisation might be quite innovative, but that's not what the core of it is about. So the core of it is about an organisation that's forward-looking, that's thinking about potential challenges and is willing to adapt to them as they go along. But it's not focused on innovation, but that might well be a part of it. It's a good question.
And a question here from Nikki. What would you suggest would be the best place to start in assessing our own organisational resilience?
Yeah, another really good question. it's something that, I mean, I suppose I'm biased, I would say this, but I think it's quite nice to be able to take, and I can share with people some details around this sort of framework, but taking your understanding and just simply having a discussion about it. So saying, okay, how do we think, we do around, what do we think about our structural clarity? What do we think about, our willingness to adapt? How do we think we sense, perhaps doing some scenario planning exercises? And I think that people can get hung up on thinking, right, okay, I've got to be a resilient organisation and we're going to do something and we're going to implement a process of work and then it'll be done. First of all, this never ends, right? This is something that needs to get embedded. But the fact that you're talking about it and thinking about it and reflecting on it, to me, is a huge place to start with it. Thanks for that, Nikki.
We've still got a few more minutes if anybody wants to send in any more questions for Kirsten. But I was thinking about some of the points you were making, and it seems to me that resilience is indistinguishable in a way from the culture, or at least you can't divorce organizational culture from resilience. And one of the points that you made was around letting go of sort of control and predict, trying to get, which is, certainly from anybody with a business mind, is almost anathema. They want to know. The Super League shows that, people want to know we've got X amount coming in and we're going to do Y with it. So it's letting go of that. And the other phrase that you use, so I don't think you used it today, but the tolerance of failure is an interesting one. And that's sort of seems to me to be part of an organizational culture where, are people willing, and it's probably got something to do with innovation as well. Do you feel as though you're given leeway to try and fail if need be, and to learn from that? How else do you learn if not by failing a little bit?
Yeah, and it's something that came out, and there you are. You're showing that you might actually have read the paper that we published on this, where one of the things we talk about in there was some of the interesting discussions that went on between our experts. And I can't, get across all the nuances in here, but I was asking them questions about how you approach failure. And as you might expect within a sport organisation, there is a big recognition of the need to fail in order to get better. But people were sort of a bit reluctant about it because other people were saying, well, there comes a time when you've got to perform. It's no good rocking up to the Olympics and saying, oh, sorry, I was having a bad day. Can I try again next week? Because that's not really going to wash. So there is a point at which you have to perform. But the idea is that most of the time there should be an atmosphere in which people are safe. And that's about psychological safety, that they feel safe and supported in order to innovate. Coming back to Terry's question earlier, they're able to innovate and they're able to try out new things, because that's the only way in which you can adapt and move forwards, is if you feel safe and you're not going to be criticised by colleagues potentially for failing.
Question just in from Philip about community organisations facing in particular capability challenges, and he cites financial constraints, presumably lack of skilled board volunteers. How can they foster resilience?
Yeah, and it's something that I have so much sympathy with, to be honest, Philip, in terms of the amount sometimes that is being asked of certain organisations on so little resource, and often, staffed by volunteers. They've got a normal full-time job. It is so difficult, and no matter what I say is not going to make it any easier. So that's the first point, is to say, I'm not saying you can wave a magic wand here and make all the problems go away. But a few things around that. One is this message about adapting to the resources that you've got. And some of these organisations can be a bit boom and bust from my speaking to people. So you might have a little bit of a windfall, a grant that comes in, might have a bit of a brand partner that comes on board for a while and gives a bit of a boost. But without that, that it's trying to match what the organisation is trying to achieve with those inputs that it's got. So in the same way that you might expect, if you get a bit of a boost, people think, oh yeah, I'll do a bit more, but they very rarely think about, okay, we can't actually achieve as much when we don't have that money coming in, and we don't have that time. The other thing is to say that it's not always a negative thing. I agree that you need a certain amount of income and a certain amount of human resource time to achieve anything, but the ability to sense and adapt, I would say, is much greater within a really small, tight organisation compared to a really large one. So it's not all negative, but as you say, I appreciate there are challenges, and there's only so far you can go with some of this.
I think we've got through all the questions there. Terry's nipped in with a second question, but given her support for the SGA over the last year, I think I'll forgive her that second question. So if resilience is about change, is a sport organisation with a fairly weak culture able to be more resilient than one which is set in their ways?
Yeah, I could do, and I won't, don't worry, another 45 minutes on organisational culture.
We're on -1 minute.
Yeah, okay, so perhaps both. Culture is this idea that you've got a culture and that it's something you can manipulate and change is something that I don't quite agree with. I think your culture is a lot to do with the sport, the individuals who work within an organisation, the geographical region, the country that you're in. There's so many things that feed into a culture that make it so hard to change. So I wouldn't necessarily say you've got a weak culture, a strong culture. I would say all organisations have some kind of culture. Some might work harder than others on trying to make something more distinctive. And I would agree that if you've really put yourself out there and you've really pinned your colour to the mast in terms of this is who we are, this is what we're doing, and therefore the implication we're never going to change it, that's very difficult. But you can have a culture in which you've got people who embrace change and innovation, things like that. And that can be very strong within them, but they don't absolutely pin their colours to the mast and say, this is who we are and we're never going to change. So I think, yeah, it's an interesting way to think about it. But that ability to be constantly changing is really quite important in resilience.
Okay, well, thank you, Kirsten. Thank you so much for that. It was such an interesting thing, and I can tell again from the reactions in the comments, it's something that people are interested in. And I mean, goes without saying after the last year or so that people are interested in resilience and becoming more resilient. I think hopefully we have, but understanding in what ways we have and how we can continue to do that, because as you say, it's a continuous process. So it's really interesting to know the sort of underlying principles behind that. So thank you so much. Good luck with the rest of the write-up and everything else. And thank you so much for that presentation.
Thanks, Craig. And thanks to Sam as well. Thanks to both of you for all your hard work in organising a really good conference. Cheers.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. And so we're moving on now to actually, it's already the final session of the day. And we're definitely not tailing off. So we thought we'd do something slightly different. We've had one semi-panel session at the start of this afternoon. Now we've got a full panel session, and we've got an exceptional group of people who are going to have a bit of a chat about where we are as a sector from a diversity perspective, and also where we'd like to get to. And for this, I'm going to hand over to Vivine Taylor, who is Sport England's still relatively new Director of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. And she's going to chair this discussion, and she's going to be joined by Pippa Britton, who's already been name-checked once today, and rightly so, who's Vice Chair of Sport Wales and a double Paralympian. Sue Anstis, who is CEO of Fearless Women and a trustee of the Women's Sports Trust. And also Carl George, who is an author and governance consultant and managing director of the Governance Forum. So I'm sure they'll introduce themselves properly, and so I'll just hand over to Vivine and she can take us through this session. Afternoon, Vivine.
Hi, good afternoon, Craig, and I really hope my Wi-Fi just holds up here, but it's great to be here and welcome everyone to today's panel discussion. I really hope you've enjoyed your conference today. We are indeed the last act, but we are by no means members of any form of any graveyard shift. I'm Vivienne Taylor, and I'm recently appointed, as Craig said, to the role of Director of Equality Inclusion at Sport England, and I'm delighted to have been invited to host this session today. And I can't host a panel discussion without a panel, and I'm honoured to be speaking today with three very experienced and well-respected individuals who I'll introduce shortly, who have all agreed in conversation with me to discuss the challenges and opportunities for the sector as we continue to grapple with the way of improving diversity in the leadership of organisations. And we want to talk lots about, we all talk lots about representation and being representative of society and achieving better outcomes in decision making and social equity. But how do we really competently and confidently do that? And what do we do when we get stuck and when we're unsure, where do we go and who do we speak to? And hopefully we'll be able to respond to some of our thinking today. So really want you to try and engage with the session, drop any questions you've got into the chat. And please continue to tweet and using the hashtag that you've been given today. And we'll try our best to keep you engaged throughout the session. And so I just want to welcome our panellists, and I hope you can see me and hear me, folks, because I can see you. I want to firstly introduce Sue Anstice, who's been a pioneer in British women's sport for over 30 years and a founding trustee of the Women's Sport Trust and a co-founder of the Women's Sport Collective, and recently appointed as a member of the RFU's new Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group, established to support RFU to reflect the diversity in society. And I'm really encouraging people to read people's profiles, because it's just such a really interesting way to understand what people are about and the expertise in the room. And then we've got Pippa. Welcome, Pippa. Again, name checked already. I haven't been, but you may have been. Most successful archer from Wales, a double Paralympian, and has represented the Welsh able-bodied team on more than 20 occasions. His passion is working with organisations towards greater inclusion, improving equity and increasing disability awareness, all with the well-being and fairness at the heart of what you're doing. That's fantastic. Welcome, Pippa. And finally, but by no means least, we've got Carl George, MD. And Carl is a thought leader and internationally established consultant in governance, with over 20 years combined experience in accountancy, business and strategic development, amongst other things. And I think one of the interesting things of your profile, Carl, is that you are an inspiring conference speaker, often being asked to come back and host other events. So I'm a little bit under pressure here, but I'm going to try and live up to your expectations and standards. But Carl is a very individual speaker, very adept at delivering days, workshops and a range of subjects, notably around corporate governance, board behaviour, trust and ethics. So welcome, panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here today, and we're going to start our conversation. And again, I would encourage people where they can to drop their questions into the chat, and I will try where I can to pull these through if we don't talk about them in the main session. So we're going to start with where we are now. And earlier, I believe Perrott Laver outlined the advantages of diverse boards. And there may still be organisations that are still not sure why changes and why diversity is really good and why it's good for business. And we know that it improves decision making amongst other things. But what is the real business case for progressing with change, and why is it so important in this context? And so, can I open the discussion with you on that question, and I'll come to the panel members.
Of course, yes. Thanks, Vivienne. Actually, it's been an amazing day today. I've learnt stuff in the Perrott Laver session this morning too. I do feel often we think we know, working in this space, in terms of the commercial advantages of having a diverse board and a management team, from all that research we've seen in the past from McKinsey and others. But I think elements around moving more so now in terms of media scrutiny and how staff feel about the organisations in which they work. So that, I would say, reputation really, I think, whether it's sports trying to attract sponsors, or and as they look to attract more players too. So I think there are many reasons beyond those that we first think in terms of why it's so important to have that diverse board, and then how it filters down across the organisation, which I'm sure we'll talk about more in the future. But yeah, for me, it's about telling the stories and sharing the success stories of where it is making a difference to businesses and sport.
And in terms of, I know Perrott Laver led that work around gender initially. Do you think there's been a kind of an impact and a real connect with the business case for increasing diversity for women specifically?
Yeah, Well, there has, and it's interesting, isn't it? I think if you look at from the previous code of governance, in terms of, we've seen that lovely shift in terms of gender balance on boards, but that doesn't really extend. And I know this isn't necessarily the remit of Sport England and UK sport, but in terms of commercial professional sport. So there was some fantastic research year before last, I think, from Farrer and Co, looking at professional sports clubs, so football, cricket, rugby. I think only about 3% of them met the 30% target. I think 11 Premier football clubs don't even have a single woman on any of their boards. So I think we have got much better in many places across sport. And I often worry that is that a bit that tick box. You know, we've got to our 30%, we've got our two, whatever the size of our board is, we've got our 2 females, we're okay now. And therefore, I was fascinated to hear some of that discussion this morning about that, focusing on a skills-based board. You know, so we're open to all people from all backgrounds. It's not just gender that we need to shift there.
Okay, thank you.
Could I?
Yeah, of course, Carl. Come on in.
Yeah, when we talk about business case, and I work across private, public, and voluntary sector, and one of the first things I think about is really how we get competitive advantage. And the last session I was just listening to, all about resilience, means that we've got to have the right competency of people around the boardroom table so that we are competitive and we can take advantage of all the skills that we've got. So the business case, and you did mention, Sue, about McKinsey, and a lot of the time when we talk about diversity, the McKinsey reports talked about gender first of all, and says that those companies outperform companies that are not as diverse. And more recently has also talked about ethnic diversity. So not just gender, but ethnicity as well. So the whole idea of having people from different skills, different backgrounds, means that you outperform. And then that's linked to Moody's recently talking about boards, that if they have more diversity on their boards, then it actually impacts their credit profile. So when you see the private sector doing that, you know that there's a reason why they think of that. And a couple more, NASDAQ, would you believe, have said that to be listed, you will have to have 2 directors from diverse backgrounds. And we know about McGregor Smith, which says full representation gives us £24 billion. So there's enough now to match the moral case with the business case, and also looking at what we do in sports.
Yeah, and I think there's so much we can learn from other sectors around this, Carl. I think you're absolutely right. I lost some of what you were saying. I think it was my internet, but I gathered most of it. That bottom line, sometimes the pound and pence in the corporate sector is actually sometimes key.
It's about the future as well, isn't
the progress.
I think it's about the future of organisations, and the if you have a diverse board, it can be reflected within the leadership of the organisation and then within the actual workforce of an organisation. And that, I think, there's that whole kind of, if you can see it, you can be it. And then you've got a whole generation of kids who are growing up and thinking, maybe I can be, an engineer or a banker or whatever it happens to be. So it isn't as simple as just saying, well, this is how we're going to affect the governance of an organisation. It's the way that the governance affects the people who work within the organisation and the people who want to be part of that organisation. And that might even be in sport, for example, where you're actually encouraging kids to become more active because they want to take part in sport because it's reflective. So I think there's a whole thing going on here, isn't there, about looking to the future as well as how this is affecting us right at the moment.
Absolutely, and it's that almost like that kind of, as you say, see to be it, but the kind of ability to see yourself in that role, but also it brings you like young leaders that kind of want to drive that as well. The kind of younger people that are thinking, yeah, I want to do this, I want to be part of this, and they kind of generate themselves. There's a moral imperative basically to do better and to do more. So I think that's really important. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to move on now onto in terms of how the current moment, a defining moment for most of us. It's been a really challenging year for more reasons than one. And diversity is featured prominently on all sorts of social media platforms, and also socially in terms in the media as well as playing out on our streets socially. But we kind of look at the significant issues that have impacted our communities, particularly with the pandemic. And it's forced a lot of organisations, a lot of companies to think differently about diversity, think differently about inclusion. And Carl, I'm going to come to you to start us here. But how do the panel think, you know, in terms of how we can use this moment to create lasting, sustainable beyond the words and beyond the statement?
Thanks, Vivian. I'm going to come from it from two perspectives. I'm going to start with governance because you know I'm the guy who gets tingly about corporate governance.
Yes, and
I'm going to say, so when I look at governance, what I'm thinking is, if we go back to 2011 and we looked at what happened with gender diversity and the Davis report and how organisations decided that we get the 30% club now, we see that there's been a movement over the last decade. We've got a moment in history where we want to think about how can we contain and also gain with that momentum. So I started to think about, what about all the recommendations, reports, pledges that people have got? And shouldn't we have a governance code? Shouldn't we have something that enables us to demonstrate how we're going to be accountable? And if you look at all the revisions, again, across sectors, whether it's housing, sport, the charity sector, one of the major influences to all governance codes updates has been the whole equality, diversity, and inclusion. So we're at that tipping point. Remember Malcolm Gladwell's book? We're at that tipping point where we're able to, if we pull all of this together, see real transformational change. So I don't want to be speaking to my children about the same thing that I was going through, which I've had to do with my teenage son. If we can do something now and we use that tipping point, we can actually go forward with this new era that says diversity, and we'll talk about cognitive diversity later on, but this diversity of age, of gender, of ethnicity is really what we need to be resilient and sustainable and be competitive. So in terms of what do we do about this moment, I think we've got to grab it with both hands, because I don't know if we're going to get an opportunity like this where we've got the awareness, we've got the attention, and we've got the empathy and sympathy of so many people to really make a change with allies and with people that should be looking at how we make the best for our organisations.
And that's kind of beyond, that's kind of into society as well, and that can quite often we're not connected in the same way. We're kind of working at it in silos most of the time. We think about it sometimes within the whole individual, but most of the time we're working about it in silos, not necessarily connecting all of that up. And how do we kind of use the kind of moment, and sport has its role to play. It is not the panacea, it is not the answer, but how do we use sport can we use sport in a way that kind of helps that diversity and kind of that connect in that moment and building that moment, Pippa?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about sports, of course, is that actually we have probably more representation in a kind of athlete community. You know, by the time you've got lots of women who are taking part, and you've got, you know, Paralympians out there, so lots of people with disabilities, and also you've got people from all sorts of different ethnic backgrounds. So I think sport has actually got a little bit of a head start on other areas of society. And in some instances, we're just a bit more prepared to talk about these things. And that's not true for every aspect of sport. But because we've already been down a journey where we've had sports that have been gender specific, for example, and women have said, well, do you know what, we can play rugby and football just the same as anybody else can. I think we've started having conversations earlier than some other aspects of society, which gives us a bit of a head start. It also means that we can use what's happening at the moment, which is actually opening things up for discussion. So if we're already further down the discussion route or further down the journey, then we have more opportunities to have those conversations. And I think it's one of the things that I found particularly is, although that there are traditional sports who have been harder to shift, and, you know, undoubtedly there's always people in life who are harder to shift. It's not just with sport. Although that's true, I think for the most part, the fact that there are sports governance codes, for example, there are an awful lot of people who see those codes as an opportunity to change behaviour. and to recognise that there are parallels between behaviour in the boardroom, for example, and how well an organisation is run. So I think that's the thing, is kind of almost reflecting some of what Carla said as well, around that sort of behavioural piece, to get people living and breathing this rather than just kind of putting it in a drawer and ticking a box and hoping it goes away. So I think we're just in a different space.
Okay, thank you. And George, and I know you've got another point that you wanted to come in on two fronts. But before we do, Sue, is there anything you want to add here before I bring Carl back in?
I just agree, and that sport can be so powerful in terms of, its cultural power, and the fact that we've got sports headlines on every news bulletin, newspaper, radio, that it kind of covers society in a way that many other sectors don't. So I do think we have an opportunity to set an example. But clearly, as Pippa mentioned, with so many of those sports, the history of being very white male dominated and run through committees and volunteers, and that's fed up to the boards almost. I think that is something that, whilst we've made great advances there, that's still a challenge for many of those sports, as we look both at the top down and the bottom up too, in terms of where people are seeking their board directors from.
Okay, thank you. So Carl, I'm going to bring you back in.
Yeah, I reflect actually. I run a leadership program. It's called the Effective Board Member Program. Started with young leaders, and in fact, it started with me trying to get black men to volunteer to go onto boards. It's across the whole sector now. But did you know that over the last few years, we've done about 300 young leaders now? We find that women are the ones who are now enrolling onto this program more than men. And I actually I find it difficult to get the men, because it's a Saturday morning for half a day with these young leaders. So most of the time, that's what we do. We do a similar program with football. So we've got a contract with the PFA. So we've done about 150 footballers, and we're trying to change the diversity in the boardroom by getting them trained up in this corporate governance, how to be effective, and then getting them into the boardroom. And the reason I mention those programs, because I'm seeing more and more interest in people understanding that they can make a change by getting into the leadership. And these are people from more and more diverse backgrounds. Coming back to what you were saying about the present moment, I think we have got that opportunity. We have got an opportunity to say, let's make a change now by getting people interested. And forgive me, by getting tingly about corporate governance and tingly about leadership and getting tingly about making change, because I really believe it starts at the top, filters its way through. And Sue and Pippa, you both mentioned actually reputation as well. What they see is what they'll be is something I used to say in a mentoring organisation I was involved in. And if we want to change the culture, if we want to change how they behave, we need to change what they see as well. So what they see reflected in the boardroom, in your organisation, will actually translate into whether they feel they can trust, whether they feel they can be a part of, or they feel they can influence your organisation.
Yeah, it's interesting to use that word trust, and that's so important in terms of, kind of getting the buy-in. If, with not just with your brand, but with your organisation, what it does, how it feels to be engaged with the organisation as well. So trust is genuinely a key point. So thank you. We are getting some questions in the chat, and I will come to them. So just keep them going. But I'm just going to move on to our next question and discussion point, which is around what should we be aiming for, and how much more is left to do, and how do we get there? And I think it's one of those things here. How do we ensure we focus on more than one issue when we talk about diversity? It's really easy to fall into default into race, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it is more than that. So I'm going to call you, Pippa. Do you want to start us in terms of what that means, what else is important here to think about and to consider?
Yeah, I mean, this is anybody who talks to me at any length of time is gonna know this is a topic that is very close to my heart. Obviously, some of you will notice my wheelchair behind me, so I'm one of the 20% or 20-odd% of people in this country who've got a disability, and so I see underrepresentation within my own group Then I see things like, the focus on women that we've had over recent years, and more recently, and rightly so, some focus on Black Lives Matter, which, there's been other groups as well that I kind of feel have been left out of the equation. My big thing about this is, my fear is for a lot of organisations is that they focus on visible diversity. So they are going to say, well, we'll have Pippa come along because Pippa's got a wheelchair. We'll have Carl come along because Carl's skin isn't the same colour as my skin, and we can see that these people are diverse. But actually what we really, really need in the boardroom is we need diverse background of thought and diverse background of experience. And I mean, I bring a lived experience of disability, and Sue's going to bring a different lived. Everybody who is here today listening to this brings a different lived experience. And the challenge that we face very often is that if we were to pick, there's a friend of mine who said to me, if we pick a black man and an Asian man and a white man, and they all went to Eton and grew up next door to each other, then actually that is probably no more diverse than having just three black men or three white men or three whatever men or women who went to Eton. I don't know if women go to Eton, sorry. But my point being that we really need to make sure that we think about the reflection of everybody in society, not just those people who, when we get a picture in our head of a place where a person will park their car who has a disability, has a picture of a wheelchair, not all disabled people use wheelchairs, and we don't all have the same background. So that's my fear sitting alongside all of this, is that we will lose sight of why do we want diversity in our boards. We want diversity in our boards because we want the best skills, we want the best people, we want the greatest breadth of experience so that we can make the best decisions. And the reason we want to make the best decisions, whether you're in sport or you're in business, is if it's in sport, you want to make the best decisions so that some kid can get out on their skateboard or their bike or play football on a Saturday morning. And that's what we want to do. And if you're in business, you want to make money. So, the reality is it's about us being the best. And how do we achieve that? And we mustn't lose sight of all of those things, but it's that kind of widest representation. And I do appreciate I've gone on for some time. So I'll
such a fantastic point though, isn't it? And I think of the piece from today, I've learned so much today. I think there is that whole, we've talked about being uncomfortable in the not necessarily getting it right in terms of language and approach. And so I'm making notes, even if Pippa's talking here, I'm thinking, have we gone through the process on board? Sometimes it's a bit of a tokenistic, not completely tick box, but we've done it and we feel we are therefore more representative. But actually, is it a diverse thought and background, and some of the things we heard this morning in terms of education, all those areas. So that's fascinating, Pippa.
Can I just
great? You've created a few questions. You've created a few questions in the chat, Pippa. I'll pick up in a moment. But Carl, please do come in.
Yeah, I was going to say I think there's 3 generations of governance and of boardroom behaviour, and I have to be careful sometimes because the first generation said just get me a non-exec, somebody who's different, and that's it. The second generation started to look at, well, I need an accountant or a lawyer or a HR, and didn't really look at age, gender and ethnicity, but started to do that. And I find myself recently arguing about cognitive diversity. And the reason I want to say a bit of caution is I think there are layers. So the first layer is the independent non-executive. The next layer is getting these functional responsibilities in. So you're not just the accountant on the board, you look at the whole area. We do want age, gender and ethnicity and disability. We do want to look at all of that. And then the next layer starts to look at that socio-demographic. It starts to look at cognitive diversity, but not to the detriment of the other layers, if that makes sense. Yeah. So it's so complicated. So I was making this argument, and people thought I was saying, no, I don't need ethnic diversity anymore. And I'm saying, nah, we still got to get that proportion right. We've still got to hit representation, but it's much more complicated. And I love your analogy than just replacing a white man with a black man with the same demographic background. Yeah. It's much more complicated than that, but we still got to look at representation, because that's how we get that different lived experience being spoken about in the boardroom.
I think, Carl, as well, it also gives you the it also gives, again, a platform, doesn't it, for people coming behind you? It's because they kind of there's very often a situation of, oh, I don't think that's for me, you know. And if you'd have asked me, you know, 20 years ago or something, would I ever be interested in governance? I'd have said, oh God, no, that's a room full of stuffy old men in suits, isn't it? You know, talking endlessly about nothing. Yeah. And yet here I am now, you know, being really passionate about it. So, and some of that is because I've seen other people lead the way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that tingly feeling, Carl. I think we're all getting it now.
Yeah, we all have that, won't we? Yeah.
We're all getting it. So that's great. And I think there is something around that lived experience and how we are using that more now. In this time, in that momentum, but also about in terms of what more we can do, which is quite straightforward. But I'm going to move over to some of the questions in the chat now, some really good ones. I think we should give them some time. Got a question here from Laddie, and just let me know if you want to answer this one, any of the panel members. We see diversity in sports, in professional sports in North America, with lots of franchises and governing organisations that have women and ethnic diverse people in C-suite positions. Why does the panel think that this is not reflected in the UK, given the evidence that Carl has just stated? So obviously back to what you said earlier around representation. Why do you think it's not the same here in the UK as it is in North America?
Can I just jump in first, just to reinforce the point I made earlier, which I think is that historical clubs, committees, constituent bodies, there's a real kind of hierarchy of where people progress to get onto those board positions. So if you take rugby union as an example, but it will take you years and years to progress through being a volunteer, being on a committee, to progress your way through to the boards. And I think that's probably that long established history that perhaps with some of the franchises on commercial sport in the States, it hasn't been so much people coming through as players and volunteers and coaches. I feel that might be the case.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Carl, do you want to add something?
Yes, I'd echo that actually, but also thinking about the talent pipeline, or which we'd say in private sector, but talent pipeline in this sector. Where are the people coming from who are going to enter into these boards? And sorry, I'm not about the governance of how you get elected. Some of the times the elections come from popularity. It comes from the same constituency of people that look like each other. And we all have got those biases that we recruit to what we like. We would say that person, not because of competence, but because of likability, has been elected to a particular position. So how do we break that barrier? How do we make sure that the structures that are in place enable us to get people on the board? And that might be shadowing, that might be reverse mentoring. It may be a number of different ways that we can, and as you quite rightly said, Pippa, is getting people to see that there are people like me sitting in these positions, which means I want to pursue a career in this area. So I think that's what we might see. And we may be a little bit behind. I'm quite surprised to hear that internationally the statistics are different. I'd probably think that they're not that much different if I was to look empirically across the different sectors. And perhaps there's a few commercial entities that have taken this on board a lot more, because in the States, they have a bit more of a rules-based approach to certain things, and we're a bit more principle-based in the UK, waiting for the principles to sort this out, and waiting for our good nature.
I think there's something else as well. We hear a lot about the deep divisions that there are in American society, but the reality is it's really quite a young country, and everybody's got a granny who came from either Germany or Ireland or the Caribbean or wherever it happens to be, and I think that because of that, they don't look at the they don't have the same kind of traditions. There's just a greater mix of people in the society, whether they're people who've got a German, Polish, Caribbean, Asian background. So I think they're starting from a different starting point from us. And I noticed somebody's put something in the chat around the Croquet Society, Croquet Association. My apologies, but it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because when people think about that, they're thinking about long traditions. And actually, if you think about baseball, you're not thinking about long traditions in the same way. And so I think it's very difficult for us to compare sport in the two societies when, for one, it's a family experience where everybody, people go to the Super Bowl and they'll spend, all day with their whole family. And perhaps in this country, you'll get groups of young men going to watch football together because it has just a different cultural history that goes along with it. So I think it can be quite dangerous for us to try and compare ourselves with other places.
Okay, thank you. Laddie, I hope that's answered your question or got at least you thinking about it differently. There's a very similar question from Terry around, can the panel give thoughts, experience on challenging solutions to managing diversity? And I think it's more around, once you get people there, how do you keep them there? That's sustaining them there. And I suppose, any thoughts on how you can make it feel real rather than, we talked a little bit about it not being a tick box and that the actual experience is valuable. How can organisations manage that?
I think there's something about support here, which this is, and first and foremost is about making people feel welcome and good inductions, being just generally inclusive of everybody, removing some barriers along the way. So as somebody with a disability, I constantly have to phone ahead and find out whether the meeting room's going to have stairs or whatever it happens to be. So as an organisation, if somebody phones me up and says, by the way, there aren't any stairs here, for me, that makes me feel included because the barrier has been removed. You actually get quite fed up with asking for things when you're disabled. With a disability, you get fed up with asking for people to get things off the top shelf or for a ramp to get here. So if someone offers it to you, that removes that barrier straight away. There are also things like if you've got somebody who comes from a poorest socioeconomic background, for example, you might think about offering expenses for interview, expenses to attend meetings. So things like that, when they're offered up front, I think provides a level of support that makes people feel included rather than them feeling like they have to go cap in hand and ask for something. And then I think there's something around just making sure that they get if they have skills gaps, that you give them the support to fill those gaps. And if they're people who aren't quite at the level that they need to be yet, so the people who come in front of you for interview and you go, oh, you're not quite there yet, then what you really need to do is be able to support those people so that they can be there soon. You don't just send them away and go, sorry, you didn't make it this time. So it's around thinking about the equitable solutions for the person who's in front of you.
Yeah, it's that whole experience, isn't it? You don't want to, you're going to get them there and then, part experience, the interview was great, meeting the panel was great, and actually being in the board meeting or in the room or in making a decision was awful. I suppose it's the whole experience of someone wanting to be there and then kind of want to try and bring someone else along and say, actually, it was a really good thing, and it worked for me, and I've got great experience as a result of it. Anything anyone wants to add before I go to the next question?
I was just going to say, I wonder whether actually with Zoom meetings and many of the board meetings I'm on now on Zoom, but actually that does help in terms of accessibility. I know the times that people hold board meetings may affect, people's backgrounds and where they're working, etc. So I think that accessibility of more boards moving to, if not all board meetings, but some may definitely help in the future. So thinking about accessibility both in terms of physically into buildings, but also the time and availability of people to travel across the country to get to places too.
Brilliant, thank you.
Sue and Pippa, exactly what I was going to say if I had my checklist. But the one thing I'll add, and you may have been the disabled board member or the woman board member, but I've been a black board member. So something happens and all of a sudden they turn to Carl, and Carl's got the idea for the whole black community. So I obviously haven't. But what I would say, actually, in terms of a more serious point, is that sometimes taking out time to listen, to learn, and if you're a black board member or a young board member and there's only one of you on the board, actually sometimes that can feel a little bit pressurized. Or you're the only woman on the board. So what we need to do is take time as board members to understand and get an appreciation of what it might be like for someone else in terms of their contributions in the boardroom. And even inducting and bringing people in is valuing different skills sometimes. So the way we might traditionally get someone on the board looking at their CV, we may have to look at different skills sometimes, which are equally reliable in determining how good someone's going to be in the boardroom, and then use those values to bring and get a right composition of board members. So I think it's the other thing to keep people there. Yeah. We have to make sure the environment comfortable in the right way, because board meetings shouldn't really be comfortable, should they? They should be challenging and stretching, but comfortable so that you can get the best out of people.
Absolutely, I totally agree with Carl. Can't agree with you any more. I can't agree less really. Sorry. Just a question, a quick one from Yashmin Harun, who also says, hello Carl, nice to see you. How important are lived experience versus education and professional experience within the boardroom? Something you raised earlier, Pippa, around that lived experience. How important are the lived experiences versus the education professional? Should we be hierarchical and should we be looking at lived experience above anything else?
I wouldn't say so. I think we're talking about, blended individuals here, aren't we? We're talking about the best people. So that will all be part of your whole. I certainly don't think that everybody needs to have a degree. I don't have a degree, so I have to say that, don't I? No, I think that if somebody is intelligent and interested and cares, and brings experience from, either the lived part of their lives, the working part of their lives. I think it's the right thing is to get the best fit, a person who can work well with other people around the board table, who can be challenging but supportive. There's a whole list of, and I know Carl is going to back me up on this, there's a whole list of skills that are so important that you need to be able to consider all of the kind of options that, again, bringing it back to that whole thing of why are we all in the boardroom? We're all there to make a difference to the people who are on the ground, either, running our sports or participating or whatever. And so that's what it is really, is I don't think you can value necessarily one thing above another, because you're talking about a group of people working together as a team to get the best outcome for the people at the end of the chain. And so no, I don't think you can put one thing above another.
Thank you, Carl.
If I don't it was Carver that said boards are incompetent groups of competent individuals. You see what happens when we bring people together, we sometimes find it difficult for them to work effectively together. So I wouldn't have a hierarchy of skills and expertise, because every organisation is different and all the needs are different, and the service users or beneficiaries or people, your members, are all going to be different. What I would say is that we look at how we get the balance right, how we get the competency right, by determining what we need in a particular environment. Sometimes actually lived experience with a particular type of charity may be the most important thing that you need to have. In other cases, it may be because of the financial nature, treasury management, that you need to have someone who understands money, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't simplify it by saying let's have a hierarchy, but let's get the balance right. Let's look at each circumstance in its own right and say, this is how we get the composition of the board to be effective for this organisation.
And the value in that is immense, really, in getting that right. I think the values, I think we talked about earlier about the business case, but actually the better decisions, the informed decisions, the kind of the pathway for other leaders to come through, it all plays out if you get all of those things right in the right way. So I think there's, Sue, is there anything you want to add before I go to what I think will be the last and final question?
No, I was just going to comment on that myth that the talent isn't out there, and I think we heard that a little bit in some of the sessions earlier today, that we can't find the right people. But sometimes that's around the language and that, that getting the pack right in terms of what you're looking for. And I think that whole, not necessarily need to be a graduate. You don't need a whole range of things, but getting that language right to make it inclusive, so people do feel they can throw their hat into the ring in the first place, I think is just so important.
Okay, Hannah, we're going to go to the final question. This is a good one. I like this one. I get asked it all the time. So unconscious. It's Yemi's question, I think. Yeah, it's Yemi's question. It's been recently been claimed that unconscious bias training is ineffective. What does the panel think about this, and what are their thoughts on other training topics that might be available to improve EDI awareness and knowledge within an organisation? I'm a host, so I'm not going to answer.
I don't mind starting on this one. I think what organisations do sometimes is try and use a plaster to fix something that needs some root cause analysis. And education is different from training. So if we were to go into an organisation and say, let's look at the education framework, let's look at how we make sure we've got psychologically safe environments for people to thrive, we then come up with the tools that help us to get there. One of the tools might be that you need to do some unconscious bias training and follow up once you've done it. Another tool may be some focus groups or diversity panels. But we use all the different tools to enable us to create a framework, an education framework that's palatable for everybody. So I don't think that the question, unfortunately, isn't the right question, because unconscious bias training may work in a particular circumstance as part of an overall strategy to deal with a particular challenge. But just using it isolated without it being part of a comprehensive EDI business-led approach doesn't work. It's got to be integrated, and we've got to look at education as a general flavour of what we're going to do.
Okay, and Sue, anything you want to add?
I mean, I think I would reflect that. I'm sure there's lots of people here who've done some unconscious bias training, and of course, then it comes down to what's the quality of the training as well. I mean, I did something relatively recently that was all online, and I came out of it as being incredibly biased towards people with a disability, which I thought was quite interesting. Or against people with a disability, and I think it was one of those things that said, press the left key on your keyboard if you agree with it, and press the right key on your keyboard if you disagree with it. And half the time I was like, so is that my left or is my right? Oh no, I didn't mean to do that. Or like, so it was not that I have any kind of prejudice towards people with disabilities, but I perhaps don't know my left from my right. And the quality of the training was quite poor. So there's that I would add, but there's also something around something that Carl mentioned about the safe space. That if you're going to have any kind of education and training for people around subjects that they don't know whether they have any bias towards a different group or another group, or whether or not they have prejudices they're not aware of, then actually creating a safe space in safe environment in which people can talk to each other, I think is a really powerful thing, and probably the most important thing, because you need to be able to be comfortable about talking about difficult subjects, whatever they happen to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the key things in terms of talking about difficult subjects. It's never easy, but that's a key thing for me this year, is that challenge, putting yourself in that uncomfortable place and staying there and being okay being there. Sue, anything you want to add finally to that?
I haven't got masses to add. They're both brilliant, these panelists, aren't they? I guess just seeing it filter down from a board then into the coaching environment and into management, general management and so on. So I think definitely that safe space and having those conversations about what we feel makes a great elite coach or a great CEO, etc. So beyond the board, hoping that would filter then through to the entire organisation in sport.
Okay, that's great. Okay, well, I think I've gone over time. Is that good, Carl? I think that's a good thing. I can't argue with that myself. I think that's been a great thing. It's been a good discussion.
I'm definitely more tingly about governance than I was at the beginning. That's good.
Great.
Yeah, it's catching, Carl. It's definitely catching. But thank you. I think it's been a really good conversation. Thank you to everyone that's dropped a question in the chat. I've tried really hard to get to them all, but they're so deep, they're so meaningful, and I hope you've got something from that. But great questions, and thank you, everybody. I'm going to hand back over to Craig now.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, everybody. Sue, Pippa, Carl, Vivine, thank you so much. That discussion was everything I knew it would be. And I knew it would be an absolutely fantastic way to end today's proceedings. And thank you for going over. That means I've got 5 minutes less to fill than I would have had otherwise, which is always very welcome. So I'm about 10 minutes away from collapsing in a relieved heap somewhere, because we've come to the end of today's conference. It's gone so quickly. And in terms of how I'm going away from this feeling, a sort of mixture in a way of I guess trepidation, because we've got still so many problems to face. And Alan this morning, I thought we just had to deal with COVID, but it turns out there are 12 sort of global, intractable, huge, interminable problems that we all have to face now. So I'm a little bit terrified. But coming through from all of today's sessions is a real positivity. And I think, what you come to these events for is to find some learning, to find new things that you didn't know, to hear from people you didn't hear from before, and to take something away that you can go and apply in your organizations, in your work life, in your personal life, whatever it may be. And I hope today we've achieved that for you. What stands out to me today is how interconnected the three themes of today's conference are. I'm not saying that we threw them together flippantly or anything like that, but the more I listen to today's speakers, the more I realize that there are so many problems out there, so many challenges for organizations to tackle, and they can only really be tackled with diversity. If you face a whole array of issues, then you need a whole array of solutions, and they don't come from homogeneity. They come from different people offering different backgrounds, and so I think if we want to be resilient, we need to be diverse. And so I'm quite pleased that the longer today's gone on, the more interconnected those themes seem to be. So I hope that you got a lot from today. I should now move on to some thank yous. But yeah, we asked quite a lot of them in terms of onboarding them onto the platform. And I know that everybody's time is really precious and they've given it so generously. So a huge thank you to all of today's speakers. And I know they've provided lots for you to take back into your organizations. I should also thank our partners. I hope you got a chance to go into the sort of virtual exhibition room and drop in on Chart Governance Institute, UK and Ireland. I must keep remembering to add that a little bit at the end after 4 years. UK Sport England and SIMSPA. They're all incredibly welcoming organisations. They've all been massive support to the SGA over the last year and a bit. And I know that if you approach them to speak more about what they're doing and what they're offering, then they'll all be very generous with their time and with their support. So please drop in on them. And I would also like to thank all the people behind the scenes, all in the loop, who have made the platform that has run so smoothly today, or at least when I asked at the beginning, not for technical issues not to be sort of posted in the Q&A box. That means I've been sort of blissfully unaware of anything that may or may not have gone wrong. So hopefully nothing went wrong. From my point of view, everything went absolutely brilliantly, which makes me think that something terrible is going to befall my house tonight, because I think I'm in line to cop all of the things that could have gone wrong personally. So if I don't see you again, that's where I am. And thank you also to Sam, who is behind the scenes. A lot of you will have been in contact with her, but won't have seen her today. She's made sure that everything has gone as swimmingly as it has gone today. And she has all the organisational skills that I don't have. So thank you to Sam. If I could encourage you to go to the SGA website, look at some of our courses, our materials. We're making all this available, as Phil said earlier this morning, to funded bodies in the first place, but to the sector more generally. So please feel free to go over there and see what you can take advantage of. And what we'd really like you to do is also take part in the huddle, the online forums over there on the website. And we've had so many comments and questions and sort of conversation starters that have been coming in the Q&A. Then please go over there and continue those conversations, because what we want this to be is shared learning. We know we've got people with questions and we've got people with answers. So the key is to put those two in the same place, and something like the huddle is absolutely ideal for that. So please go over there and take advantage of that. Continue to use the hashtag if you form, because we want to know if we're doing the right things, if we're getting it right, if we're helping you. And the best way for us to get that insight is for you to tell us. As I said at the beginning, you can tell us if we're doing things right. I'm not afraid of that. But also tell us if you'd like us to do things slightly different, or give us any suggestions for how we can meet your sort of needs better, because that is, after all, what we're here for. We want to support the sector, the governance community within the sector. And so just tell us what you need and we'll do our best to try and provide it. So if you fill out those feedback forms, you'll be entered into a draw to win. First prize, books to the value of £100 from the Chartered Governance Institute's bookstore. I can't promise any Richard Osman bestsellers. They're all governance books, I'm afraid. But knowing some of the people on this call, that's actually probably what you'll get the biggest kicks out of, which is A, worrying, and B, encouraging. So £100 for the first prize, two prizes of £50 for second and third. So just fill in a feedback form, and I'll be in touch at some point in the future with those three winners. So really, it just falls to me now to say thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Please keep in touch. Keep talking to us. Keep talking about governance, and keep telling us how we can help you. We want to stay for a long time, and we hope that you'll be with us every step of the way. So thank you all once again for giving so freely of your time. I know it's a precious commodity, so thank you for spending the day with us. And I don't know if you're clocking off or if you're going back to do some work, but good luck, whichever you're doing. And thank you so much for all your attention and your time today. Thank you.